From petty insults to full-blown political warfare, some of America's earliest leaders hated each other so intensely that their feuds shaped the course of history. You might think dirty politics is a modern invention, but think again. It all started with the founding fathers themselves. Take John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, for example. Once inseparable allies, they co-authored the Declaration of Independence, shared philosophical debates over wine in Europe, and dreamed of the future of the young republic. But everything changed in 1796 when both men ran for president. Adams edged out Jefferson to win the election. And under the Constitution of the time, Jefferson became vice president. Imagine that. Your fiercest rival is your number two. Tensions soared. By the 1800 election, their political battle turned downright vicious. Jefferson's camp, with help from the infamous attack journalist James Callender, described Adams as, quote, a hideous, hermaphroditical character, neither the firmness of a man nor the gentleness of a woman. Ouch. Adams's supporters retaliated by labeling Jefferson a low-lived, mean-spirited schemer. The mudslinging went so far that it reshaped public perception of political campaigns forever. In the end, Jefferson won. Adams, furious and humiliated, famously snuck out of Washington at 4 a.m. on Inauguration Day, making him the first president to skip his successor's ceremony. The personal bitterness stemmed from policy and principle. Adams felt betrayed by Jefferson's behind-the-scenes maneuvering, while Jefferson saw Adams's alien and sedition acts as authoritarian overreach. Their friendship died, their working relationship vanished, and their rivalry became one of the defining stories of early American politics. Yet history has a softer side. Years later, Adams and Jefferson reconciled through letters, rekindling their friendship before dying on the same day. July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the declaration they once signed together. At least these two buried the hatchet. Eventually. But not every presidential feud ended so gracefully, because next up, we move to the next generation. John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. And let me warn you, this rivalry got ugly fast, with accusations flying, personal attacks, and even deaths linked indirectly to political sabotage. If you thought Adams versus Jefferson was intense, wait until you see what happens when Jackson enters the picture. Trust me, you won't believe how far these fights went. If you thought the political battlefield was intense in the Adams-Jefferson era, wait until the feud between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson unfolds. This was a rivalry that didn't just involve personal insults. It altered the very structure of American politics. The stage was set in 1824. Four major candidates vied for the presidency: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William H. Crawford, and Henry Clay. Jackson won the popular vote and led in the Electoral College, but he fell short of a majority. According to the 12th Amendment, the House of Representatives would decide the winner. Here's where things went sideways. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House and an ambitious politician in his own right, threw his support behind Adams. The public outcry was immediate. Jackson's camp cried foul, calling it a corrupt bargain. Jackson didn't take the loss lightly, spent the next 4 years plotting a political comeback, promising to defeat Adams in the next election. By 1828, the rematch had transformed into a full-scale political blood sport. Adams's allies painted Jackson as a violent, uneducated brute, while Jackson's supporters went after Adams personally, attacking his integrity and even dragging his family into the fray. Jackson's wife Rachel, in particular, became a target of vicious rumors, which devastated Jackson emotionally. Weeks before his inauguration, she passed away, and Jackson publicly blamed the campaign's attacks for her death. The rivalry had now become deeply personal. When Jackson finally defeated Adams in 1828, Adams mirrored his father's earlier snub and refused to attend the inauguration. In response, Jackson opened the White House doors to the public, inviting supporters to celebrate a chaotic, rowdy spectacle that contrasted sharply with Adams's dignified exit. The feud didn't just end with personal humiliation. It fractured the Democratic-Republican Party, giving birth to the modern two-party system we recognize today. This rivalry set a precedent for the intertwining of personal vendettas with political battles. It showed that elections weren't just about policy, they could be about revenge, public humiliation, and lasting resentment. And it wasn't just politics. The stakes were human too. Jackson's loss of his wife, coupled with the relentless attacks, made this one of the most emotionally charged feuds in American history. From political backstabbing to personal tragedy, Adams versus Jackson illustrated how deeply the pursuit of power could poison relationships, destroy reputations, and reshape the course of a nation. And while this chapter closed with Jackson ascending to the presidency, America had only begun to see how presidential feuds could escalate to life-altering consequences. But if you think Jackson versus Adams was intense, wait until the post-Civil War era, where a president and his military hero came to blows, and their feud would shape the very future of Reconstruction. If political feuds could change history, few were as consequential as the clash between Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant. In the aftermath of the Civil War, America was a nation in crisis. Lincoln's assassination thrust Johnson into the presidency, and his vision for Reconstruction clashed sharply with that of the Union's most celebrated general. Johnson's approach was lenient. He wanted to pardon former Confederates, restore Southern political power quickly, and move on from the war. Grant, by contrast, sided with Congress and the radical Republicans, advocating for strict Reconstruction policies to protect the rights of newly freed Black Americans and prevent the old Southern elite from regaining control. The two men were supposed to be allies, but their alliance quickly deteriorated. The tension boiled over when Johnson attempted to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a steadfast ally of the radical Republicans. Stanton refused to leave his post, and Congress had passed the Tenure of Office Act, making it illegal for the president to remove certain officials without Senate approval. In a desperate move, Johnson asked Grant to temporarily replace Stanton. Grant reluctantly agreed, only to hand the position back when Congress objected. Furious, Johnson publicly accused Grant of betraying him, defying the commander-in-chief, and acting with insubordination. Grant wasn't about to be intimidated. He responded with a calm, detailed letter that contradicted Johnson's claims and defended his own integrity. This feud wasn't mere political posturing. It became a national spectacle about trust, authority, and the future of Reconstruction. By the time Grant was inaugurated in 1869, the animosity was palpable. He refused to ride in the carriage with Johnson, who, in turn, stayed in the White House, signing documents to avoid his successor entirely, a move reminiscent of John Adams decades earlier. The consequences of their hostility were real. Johnson's leniency threatened the progress of Reconstruction, while Grant's insistence on enforcing civil rights through federal troops reshaped the South. Their feud highlighted how personal grudges could influence national policy and even affect the protection of citizens' rights. Johnson versus Grant stands out not just for political drama, but for the way it demonstrates that presidential rivalries can impact the fate of millions. Personal resentment spilled into governance, forcing decisions that had lasting effects on America's path toward equality and justice. Unlike some earlier feuds, this one wasn't limited to insults or public humiliation. It directly influenced the nation's recovery from civil war. If you thought this was intense, wait until you see two former allies, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, go from best friends to bitter enemies, shaking the Republican Party to its core. Few presidential rivalries were as personal and as explosive as the split between Theodore Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. What makes this feud remarkable is that it began as a friendship. Roosevelt handpicked Taft as his successor in 1908, expecting him to continue the progressive reforms he championed, breaking up monopolies, protecting labor rights, and conserving natural resources. Roosevelt thought he was passing the torch to an elite he was in for a shock. Once in office, Taft began drifting right. He sided with conservatives, undermined some of Roosevelt's progressive policies, and even fired several of Roosevelt's allies. The betrayal stung. Roosevelt felt like his hand-picked successor was actively erasing his legacy. By 1912, the gloves were off. Roosevelt emerged from retirement to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination, a showdown that shook the party to its core. The insults were brutal and public. Roosevelt called Taft a puzzle wit with less brains than a guinea pig and labeled him a flub-dub, implying incompetence. Taft, usually mild-mannered, hit back with the term honeyfuggler, an archaic insult suggesting someone who sweet-talks while lying behind your back. Americans were left scratching their heads and checking dictionaries, trying to keep up with the verbal onslaught. Roosevelt's frustration didn't stop at insults. He formed a third party, the Progressive Party, often called the Bull Moose Party, just to ensure Taft wouldn't win. This move split the Republican vote, paving the way for Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win in a landslide. The election was a humiliating defeat for Taft, who reportedly broke down in tears, devastated that his former friend had turned him into a national punchline. The Roosevelt-Taft feud illustrates how personal relationships can collide with political ambition. Their rivalry wasn't just about policy. It was about betrayal, trust, and legacy. Roosevelt felt his ideals were being erased, while Taft felt attacked by a man he once considered a mentor. The clash reshaped the Republican Party, creating divisions that would take years to heal. Beyond party politics, the feud also reflected a clash of personalities. Roosevelt was a fiery, charismatic reformer, willing to take bold risks. Taft, by contrast, was methodical and legalistic, preferring the slow, steady approach. Their inability to reconcile these differences turned friendship into public spectacle, demonstrating that presidential rivalries can reach dramatic, almost theatrical levels. And if you think a political betrayal can only hurt reputations, wait until you see a feud during the Great Depression that nearly worsened a national economic crisis. Herbert Hoover versus Franklin D. Roosevelt is next, and it's a masterclass in how political grudges can put a country at risk. Few rivalries demonstrate the real-world consequences of presidential feuds quite like Herbert Hoover versus Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1932, the United States was drowning in the Great Depression. Banks were failing, unemployment was skyrocketing, and breadlines stretched for miles. Against this backdrop, Hoover, the outgoing Republican president, faced Roosevelt, the Democratic challenger, promising bold new solutions. Hoover saw himself as a principled, steady leader, trying to stabilize the country, while Roosevelt was charismatic and full of ideas. But their personal dislike made cooperation impossible. Hoover famously despised Roosevelt, sneering that he was a chameleon on plaid, constantly changing his stance to fit the moment. Roosevelt fired back, calling Hoover a fat, timid capon, a term for a castrated rooster, implying cowardice and weakness. These barbs were more than colorful insults. They symbolized deep mistrust and a clash of philosophies at a moment when the country could least afford it. The tension didn't end with the election. Back then, presidents weren't inaugurated until March, leaving a 4-month lame duck period. During these months, the banking system teetered on collapse. Hoover begged Roosevelt to publicly support emergency measures to restore confidence. Roosevelt refused, fearing association with Hoover's failing policies would hurt him politically. Hoover called this refusal the coldest-blooded political act ever undertaken, and it arguably worsened the financial panic. In March 1933, the inauguration was tense, but highly symbolic. Outgoing and incoming presidents traditionally rode together to the Capitol. Hoover and Roosevelt did, but in icy silence. The photograph of them sitting stiffly side by side captures a moment of political Cold War, with the nation literally hanging in the balance. Hoover's refusal to work with Roosevelt highlighted the dangers of personal animosity in the presidency. The feud wasn't just about party differences, it endangered Americans' trust in the government and slowed decisive action during an economic catastrophe. This rivalry illustrates how presidential grudges can affect the entire country. Hoover's disdain for Roosevelt prevented a unified front at a time when public confidence was crucial. Roosevelt, meanwhile, used the situation to consolidate his political advantage, showing that rivalry isn't just personal, it can be strategic, with life-or-death consequences for millions of citizens. If you think economic warfare between presidents is dramatic, wait until you see how Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower turned personal disagreements into a tense, Cold War-era transition that nearly jeopardized national security. Even in peacetime, presidential rivalries can have real consequences. After World War II, Harry Truman admired General Dwight D. Eisenhower and even encouraged him to pursue a political career. But by 1952, the dynamic between the two had completely changed. Truman became furious when Eisenhower failed to publicly defend General George Marshall, a trusted advisor and architect of the Marshall Plan. From Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts, Marshall wasn't just any general. He was a towering figure in U.S. history and one of Truman's closest confidants. Eisenhower, newly entering politics, stayed silent under pressure from advisors who feared alienating conservative voters. Truman saw this as cowardice, a betrayal of principle. During the 1952 campaign, he publicly criticized Eisenhower, accusing him of putting votes over integrity. Eisenhower took the attacks personally, and their relationship unraveled. By Inauguration Day 1953, the tension was palpable. Truman invited Eisenhower for pre-inauguration coffee, but the general declined, leaving the transition cold and awkward. Truman's feuds didn't stop there. He harbored intense disdain for Richard Nixon, famously calling him a no-good lying bastard who could lie out both sides of his mouth at the same time. Truman accused Nixon of ruthlessly smearing opponents during the Red Scare, and even decades later, he openly criticized Nixon from his Missouri home. This wasn't just political theater, it was personal. Highlighting Truman's uncompromising view of ethics and integrity in leadership, fast forward to Lyndon B. Johnson. His rivalry with JFK began before the assassination, rooted in political strategy rather than friendship. Johnson, a veteran Texas politician, felt sidelined by the Kennedy administration and often clashed with JFK's inner circle, including Bobby Kennedy. Once in office, LBJ used his power to limit the influence of Kennedy loyalists and even enacted anti-nepotism legislation to prevent similar dynasties. Johnson's animosity extended to Richard Nixon as well. During the 1968 presidential campaign, Nixon's team secretly sabotaged peace talks in Vietnam to improve his electoral chances. Johnson discovered the betrayal and accused Nixon of treason, claiming he had blood on his hands. FBI wiretaps and intelligence later confirmed Johnson's suspicions. Despite the severity of the act, Johnson chose to remain quiet publicly, avoiding a political firestorm that would have revealed government surveillance. These rivalries show that presidential feuds aren't just about insults. They can affect national security, foreign policy, and public trust. Truman, Johnson, and their contemporaries demonstrate that personal animosity in politics can ripple outward, influencing critical decisions during tense and transformative periods of American history.